Can I ask, first of all, whether a decision was ever taken during your tenure as First Minister to deprioritise investment in dueling the A9 project?
No, not as far as I'm aware. You were in government during, I think, most of that time, Fergus, so you would be aware of any decisions there. We were, as is in the nature of budgetary processes, and you remember as well as I do some of the difficult discussions we had around the cabinet table about budgets. We have to balance the competing priorities, and there will be at different times different projects will have greater immediate priority than others, but it's always about trying to balance and achieve the objectives that we have set.
Sure. I mean, obviously, we did, as a party, promise, I think, from 2007 in manifestos and ever since. And then from 2011, the dueling promise had the target date of 225. We have seen an extract from a November 2018 Cabinet paper advising that the use of private finance would mean the 25 completion date could not be met. So I just wonder, how can that be squared with the assertion that it only became clear in 223 last year that the 225 deadline would not be met?
I think it can be squared pretty easily, actually, drawing on what I've just said. And I don't know how many of the papers you would have been seeing personally at the time around this, but there was absolutely, we were not at that point at a position where we had decided it was definitely private finance, because we didn't at that point have a clear private finance route, or that it was publicly funded straight capital provision. So at that point, the situation was, had we gone down a private finance route, the 2025 target wouldn't have been capable of being met, but we hadn't closed the door to the design build capital funded option. It was only, I think, if memory serves me correctly, at the end of 2022 or thereabouts, that it became clear that there was no route to a 2025 target. Now, with any kind of target, obviously the closer you get to it, there is a diminishing prospect of it being met. But until that point, there was, at least in theory, a route to 2025, and that closed off round about the end of 22-23, and clearly other factors at play around then as well.
I mean, I think it's fair to say we've heard evidence from industry that industry as a whole, the kind of civil engineering contracting world, knew from 218 at the latest that 225 just wasn't going to be met in practice, because the scale of the work required could not be done in 7 years. So, I mean, the suggestion really is, and as you pointed out, Nicola, I was in government as well, so I've said on several occasions that if there's any responsibility that we must accept for the failure to dual the A9, I am part of that, although I never had portfolio responsibility and I didn't receive papers on this matter, I think, from 2018. But do you feel now that because this target was such a major promise for so long, both for the SNP and for the Scottish Government, that an apology should be provided to the people of the Highlands? Because, the issue, I think it's fair to say, in my perception at any rate, in my constituency and in the Highlands in general, has been met with considerable dismay and concern, especially in view, of course, of the tragic loss of life we have seen.
So I want to answer this question quite carefully and seriously, because people will have heard me during my time as First Minister readily apologise for things that I think merit an apology. I also think it's really important not to reduce the value of that by simply saying these things to get out of a tight spot. I am sorry that we haven't dualled the A9 by 20, or won't dual the A9 by 2025, and I regret that, and I think people in the Highlands have every right to feel the way they do about that. not just because it's a target that was set and not met, but the nature of the project and the reasons for the commitment to dualling the A9 were so serious in terms of safety, and obviously the loss of life on the A9 is a matter of deep regret for everybody. Then I think those feelings are justified. I think where I want to be clear, though, is that I do not accept that the failure to meet that target is because we just didn't bother and we weren't trying to meet that target. It was because the 2025 target was set, and it was set for the right reasons, and we were committed to it. I was Deputy First Minister at the time that target was set in a governmental sense, so I'm not trying to escape responsibility. I had then no direct involvement in the A9. But when I look at that now, I would ask myself, were we as candid as we should have been with ourselves as well as with the public about just how challenging it would always have been, even with the fairest of winds, to meet that target? And then my second point, which I've made already, is that a number of things then happened that were not foreseen or even in some cases foreseeable, that meant it was even more difficult to meet that. So what I'm saying here is, and I'll be careful in what I say here, I'm not sitting here saying I'm sorry because we messed up, because we just didn't bother trying to do this. I'm sorry that a whole range of circumstances, many beyond our control, meant that we weren't able to deliver on that target. And I absolutely understand the feelings of people in the Highlands about that. And that's why I think I'm no longer in government, obviously. But that's why I think it's so important now that the project is completed on the revised timescales that have been set.
Well, thank you for that answer. But could I press you on a couple of more points, please? It does seem to me that well, first of all, an awful lot of preparatory work, design work, prep work, choosing the preferred route, the progress to made orders, the compulsory purchase orders, the ancillary roads orders, that all is very time-consuming, very complex, and you've alluded to that earlier. But do you not feel that, as I do, that some of the 11 sections could and should have moved into procurement much earlier, and that is a failure? So
I think, I don't want to just repeat everything I've said. We ran into a period where we didn't have obvious funding procurement routes, and that's what a lot of the work was being done to resolve. But the second point, and perhaps just the more open point, is given the slippage in the timescale, the considerable slippage in the 2025 timescale, I do think that, and obviously it's what this committee is doing, at least in part right now, but for the government at an appropriate point, I do think, for the purpose of learning lessons for future projects of whatever scale, I think it is important to look back, and notwithstanding everything I've said about the very real reasons that we were confronted with that have led to the delays we're talking about here, to look back and say, and ask ourselves, or government to ask itself, were there points where different decisions could have accelerated? For example, other sections of the route going into procurement more quickly. Now, saying that is not me sitting here saying that I think the answer to that is yes, but I think it would be reasonable and perhaps unreasonable not to do an exercise that openly asked those questions and learned appropriate lessons.
Just to ask the same question but in a more specific form, it is clear from the documentation that 4 of the 11 sections went to made orders. They went to the completion of the land identified to be compulsorily purchased and all the ancillary roads orders. They went to made orders. 2 went in July 21 and another 2 in October 21. And I genuinely do not understand, and I've obviously raised this in this session of Parliament, but I genuinely don't understand why those sections are not in procurement now, and why they weren't moved swiftly into procurement. And I wonder if if that's a question that you can either answer now, or because it's quite a specific question of which you haven't had notice, whether you could go away and let us have an answer, because many people say, and I'm not making this assertion, but many people say that the influence of the Green Party as part of the government since 2021 has had a negative effect, because plainly they alone of all the parties represented in Holyrood are opposed to the dualling of the A9, and very strongly opposed, and therefore there is a very strong feeling, Convener, and I've got no evidence for this, so we're quite candid, but there's a very strong feeling that their role played a part in that. And I wonder if you could address that point, but also if you're able to now, or if not later, because it's a specific and detailed question, and we can provide you with the names of each of the 4 sections, but I'm not going to do that now.
Sure.
But, because they went to that really milestone stage of made orders, why weren't they moved into procurement at that time, if we were serious about progressing the project as quickly as possible?
So let me try and answer it as best I can, and perhaps in a general sense. I'm more than happy to go away from this session on any particular point and look at the paperwork and come back with specific answers in writing if that's helpful to the committee. Can I say 2 things though in general? Firstly, it's not the case that this was down to the Green involvement in government. In fact, people can read the Butte House Agreement for themselves. The commitment to the A9 was not affected by the Butte House Agreement. So, somebody who was First Minister during that time, that was not the case. My second point, though, goes into what, sort of with the caveat that I will go and look again to see whether, there are perhaps other issues that I can throw some light on. But we're talking about a period when, our budgets were under significant and growing pressure, revenue and capital budgets. And we were, as a government, and you members of Parliament have, heard the statements that different finance secretaries have made in recent times about the need for savings, the need to reprioritise, and we all know the reasons for this. But the overarching reason will have been the funding challenges that we have been confronted with, and the ongoing work to try to find ways of either through direct capital or a private finance model progressing these sections. So that is in my view, the overarching reason. But as I say, I'm happy to go away and see if there's further comments that might be helpful.
Just a final question on this issue. Why is it that you argue that there is such a pressure on funding when the capital budget is and has been circa 4,000 to 5,000 million a year, and the estimated cost of dualling the A9 is very substantially less than that? So, given the scale of the capital budget, surely many people are right to say that the A9 just wasn't the top priority for the Scottish Government, because there was the money. There's 4,000 or 5,000 million a year. Plainly, at least some of the sections which haven't yet been dualled could have been dualled if more priority was attached. And again, Nicola, that is a strongly held view within the Highlands, so that's why I'm putting it to you today, to see if you think that that's a fair point, or if it's completely unfair to yourself and your colleagues who were making the decisions at the time.
If it's possible to be both of those things, I know that's probably the classic politician answer, which I'm trying not to give. It's absolutely fair point for people in the Highlands to look at it and say, well, the A9 should have been prioritised above the other demands on the capital budget. And if I was living in the Highlands, no doubt that is the view I would have. So I am not in any way suggesting that that is somehow an unfair observation or view for Highlanders to hold. I suppose the other part of that, though, is in the way you pose that question to me, and I understand why you're doing it, and you're doing it on behalf of your constituents, so I'm not criticising that in any way, but you've been in government for many years. To point to a big budget with a particular project that is relative to the size of the budget relatively small, and say, well, why couldn't that have been done, just doesn't fully encapsulate the process of budgeting. So whatever the quantum of the capital budget was, and you know this as well as I do from your time in government, the demands on that budget, for most of the time I was in government, if not all of the time, exceeded the quantum of the budget. Now, within that, of course, there is a legitimate question about the relative priority that different projects get. But the process of budgeting is we try to balance all of these things to progress everything we want to do. And that will inevitably lead to different projects, or supporters of different projects feeling at times that theirs is not getting the priority it needs. But simply to point to the size of the budget and the cost of the A9 and somehow say that there was no problem with funding our capital programme, I think is not, that's the bit that's not a fair characterisation of how these things work.
I mean, as the conveners said, our focus is not really so much trying to carry out a post-mortem. It's it's more prognosis than diagnosis in terms of how can we put this right and how can we put it as right as quickly as possible. And do you think it's fair, as a seasoned, experienced politician, that you would consent to this, that other parts of Scotland have actually done quite well in terms of transport infrastructure projects over devolution, over the 25 years where both of us have been servants in this place? We've seen the Borders Railway, we've seen, as you said, the Aberdeen Peripheral Road, we've seen massive improvements in the M74 and M8, we've seen the Forth Crossing, magnificent, and Edinburgh chose the trams. So other parts of Scotland have had massive investment, and that's welcome. But would you agree that it's now, if you like, the Highlands' turn?
I'll invite Maurice Goldwyn to come in with the question.
Yes, just as an aside, Edinburgh, Parliament at the time, against the wishes of the government you and I were both part of, choosing the trams did have an implication on other aspects of the capital programme at that time, but that's an aside. All of these projects you've spoken about were necessary and important projects. As a relatively new driver, I've only recently been driving across some of these projects. I drove the A9 myself for the first time just a couple of weeks ago. So these projects were all important, and I don't think it is, and I don't think this is the point you're making. It's not the case that we inappropriately prioritise, whether the Queensferry Crossing or the M74 improvements or the Borders Railway. But I suppose my short answer to your question would be yes. I do think now it should be, as I would argue it has been, albeit that we ran into the difficulties that I've been speaking about. I would certainly hope and expect that the government now prioritises completing the A9, and I think the programme now that has been set out with the timescales will still have challenges along the way. I would be astonished if it didn't. That, to me, it looks like a programme that will succeed, and I think it is absolutely essential that it's given the priority to ensure that it does.
Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. Ms Sturden, you've made clear in answer to Fergus Ewing regarding the Greens' influence on the dualling of the A9, but obviously the backdrop to your tenure in government was some very ambitious climate change targets, including in 2019 the setting of an extremely ambitious interim target. So I wonder if climate change and looking to tackle that in the context of failing to meet a number of emissions targets had any influence over the priority of dualling the A9?
I think that's a really good question, and I think it's an important question when we're considering any roads projects. In respect of the A9, and obviously we could talk about this in a lot more detail, we might do that, but generally no, I don't think it did. And the reason the A9 was, if I'm using shorthand here, effectively kind of excluded from the Butte House Agreement, the commitment to do that continued, was because of the reasons why the dualling of the A9 is important. It's not about providing extra road capacity for more cars. It's fundamentally about safety, and therefore it is a roads project that is important to complete. I think more generally, when it comes to road projects in this day and age, the climate cannot be divorced from these considerations, and that is an important part of any deliberation. But in the sense of the A9, I would argue strongly that the reason we're sitting here talking about delays to the duelling of the A9 is not about the Greens being in government or because we downgraded the priority of that for some consideration of climate and emissions targets.
Thanks, that's very helpful. I'm just trying to square the timeline in my own mind, and broadly on the basis of the evidence we've heard, around 2014 seems to be the point in which the plausibility of completing the project, a red flag was raised, and I think you pointed to 2014 in terms of the financing aspect. Probably around 2018 was where there was a significant change in that, but the Scottish Government didn't announce or didn't find out until 2022 that it wouldn't be plausible to complete by 25. I'm struggling to find that explanation as realistic and plausible on the basis of the track record and what had gone before. I wonder if you could perhaps comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, so looking at this now from the perspective I've got, I think some of these questions and that the committee is posing are reasonable. That doesn't mean that there's anything sinister there. It's about looking back at something and thinking, we were in a position as a government where we were desperately trying to find a path to meet a 2025 target. The prospect and chances of doing that obviously were diminishing with every year, month that passed, but we hadn't given up on that. The 2014 date is significant because of the ONS issue with the classification of NPD, which then meant not that that was the point we had to consider a private finance option. That was always a requirement, but we had to effectively scrap the one that would have been the option and try to find another one, which took some considerable work and time to do. And then this period around 2018, which I think I said in response to the convener, if I'm looking at this now in hindsight, that's a point where I think it is reasonable to at least pose the question, should we just have been airing a bit more of this publicly? Because we were, I think originally, if I'm remembering this correctly, the sort of estimate for construction was about 6 years. So by 2018, you're getting to that point that even if you've got the finance procurement route settled, you're starting to get tight for a 2025 target. So perhaps if I was to go back to relive that period, I don't think I've read anything that would make me think here's something we could have done to have changed things and actually managed to hit that target. But I think I would say we should perhaps just have been airing a lot more of the difficulties we were in at that point, or challenges we were facing at that point, maybe a bit more openly. But that's me applying hindsight.
Thank you. What was the impact of COVID on the project?
I mean, the impact of COVID on the A9 project would have been multifaceted, as it was on every aspect of government priorities outside of what was required to manage COVID. So it would have, it would have been civil service time. It would have been, the sort of wider industry engagement. It would have been everything associated with a big project would have been and was impacted by. Again, I'm using shorthand here, which is probably always a bit dangerous, but effectively, not just here, everywhere, outside what we needed to do to deal with COVID, kind of the rest of government sort of shut down to some extent. And that, of course, impacted the A9 project as it did many other things as well.
And